The Iraq War was one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history. Many things about this war were hidden from the public. From the real reason behind the war to the human cost and economic consequences, a lot of information was kept secret. When the U.S. invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003, the official reason given to the public was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The Bush administration claimed that Iraq was an immediate threat and that military action was necessary to protect the world from potential attacks. But as time passed, these justifications completely fell apart. The claim that Iraq had WMDs was one of the biggest lies in modern history. In the months leading up to the war, the U.S. government repeatedly told Americans that Iraq had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and was actively developing nuclear weapons. The Bush administration used this argument to convince Congress and the public that an invasion was the only option. One of the main pieces of evidence was a report that Iraq had tried to purchase uranium from Niger to build nuclear bombs. The British government first made this claim in 2002, saying they had intelligence that Iraq sought yellow cake uranium from Niger. The Bush administration repeated this claim despite knowing it was unverified and likely false. In February 2002, former U.S. diplomat Joseph Wilson was sent to Niger to investigate the claim. He found no evidence that Iraq had purchased uranium. However, the White House ignored his findings. In January 2003, during the State of the Union address, President Bush declared that the British government had learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. This statement was later revealed to be completely false. A few months after the invasion, the documents used to support this claim were found to be forgeries. The International Atomic Energy Agency quickly exposed them as fake, pointing out errors in names, signatures, and formatting. Despite this, the U.S. had already invaded Iraq. Later, when Wilson publicly exposed the truth, the White House retaliated by leaking the identity of his wife, Valerie Plame, who was a covert CIA agent. This political scandal, known as the Plame Affair, showed how far the administration was willing to go to silence the truth. Another important moment came in February 2003, which involved an Iraqi defector codenamed Curveball. His real name was Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, and he was a key source for the claim that Iraq had mobile biological weapons labs. Curveball was an unverified source who had fled Iraq in the 1990s. German intelligence had warned the U.S. that Curveball was unreliable and possibly lying. But the CIA and the Bush administration ignored these warnings. Despite the lack of credibility, Curveball's claims were used by Colin Powell in his infamous February 2003 UN speech, where he presented satellite images and sketches of supposed biological weapons labs on wheels. After the invasion, no such labs were ever found, and Curveball later admitted that he had lied to help overthrow Saddam Hussein. Before the invasion, the United Nations had sent weapons inspectors to Iraq to investigate whether Saddam Hussein had WMDs. The inspectors, led by Hans Blix and Mohammed El-Baradi, conducted extensive searches and found no evidence of active WMD programs. The government had misled the world to justify the war. The Bush administration also tried to link Saddam Hussein to Al-Qaeda. They suggested that Iraq had helped plan the 9/11 attacks and was providing training and support to terrorists. But this claim was also false. In reality, Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda were enemies. Saddam ran a secular dictatorship, while Al-Qaeda was an extremist Islamic group that wanted to overthrow secular governments. There was no evidence that Saddam had any connection to Osama bin Laden, or that he supported the 9/11 attacks. Even the 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, found that there was no collaborative relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Despite this, the Bush administration continued to suggest otherwise, using fear to gain public support for the war. If the war wasn't about WMDs or terrorism, then why did the U.S. invade Iraq? The real reasons were far more strategic and self-serving. Iraq has the 5th largest oil reserves in the world, with vast untapped resources. It was seen as a major economic prize. Before the invasion, Iraq's oil industry was state-owned, meaning foreign companies had no access to its oil profits. However, after the U.S. removed Saddam Hussein, Iraq's oil industry was opened up to private corporations, particularly American and British oil companies. In 2001, 2 years before the invasion, a secret National Security Council document showed that the Bush administration was already discussing how to divide Iraq's oil reserves. The document, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information Act request, included maps of Iraqi oil fields and detailed plans for how American companies could benefit. After the invasion, Iraq awarded contracts to major oil companies like ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell, which had been locked out of the country before. This proved that control over Iraq's oil was a key motivation for the war. Iraq's location also made it strategically important for the U.S. By invading Iraq, the U.S. established a strong military presence in the Middle East, giving them more control over the region. With Iraq under American influence, the U.S. could pressure neighboring countries like Iran and Syria, both of which were seen as threats. The war also helped the U.S. protect its allies. Saudi Arabia and Israel had long been concerned about Saddam Hussein's influence in the region. Removing him strengthened their positions and ensured that Iraq would not challenge them in the future. The Bush administration was determined to go to war, but they needed a reason that would convince the American public and the world. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, there was widespread fear of terrorism, and the U.S. government used this fear to push the idea that Iraq was part of the problem. Intelligence agencies, including the CIA, DIA, and NSA, initially reported that Iraq's military capabilities were limited, and that there was no strong evidence of WMDs or links to al-Qaeda. However, as President George W. Bush, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice prepared for war, they demanded intelligence reports that supported their claims. Officials pressured analysts to reinterpret data and ignore reports that contradicted the case for war. One of the most infamous examples of this manipulation was the Office of Special Plans, a secret unit created within the Pentagon to bypass traditional intelligence channels and produce reports that made Iraq look like a serious threat. The OSP, led by Douglas Feith, a top aide to Donald Rumsfeld, selectively used unreliable sources and exaggerated claims to make Iraq's weapons programs appear more advanced than they actually were. One of the most damning pieces of evidence showing how intelligence was manipulated is the Downing Street Memo, a secret British government document leaked in 2005. The memo, dated July 23, 2002, detailed a meeting between British Prime Minister Tony Blair and his top officials, including MI6 Director Richard Dearlove. In this meeting, Dearlove reported that the U.S. had already decided to invade Iraq, and that intelligence was being fixed around that policy. This meant that instead of letting facts determine policy, the Bush administration was shaping intelligence to justify an invasion. The memo also revealed that the U.S. was aware that Saddam Hussein was not an immediate threat. British officials expressed concerns that the legal justification for war was weak, but despite these concerns, Blair still supported Bush's decision. This document is one of the clearest pieces of evidence proving that the war was planned long before it was officially announced, and that intelligence was deliberately manipulated to convince the public that war was necessary. Beyond the Downing Street memo, several other internal reports and leaked documents confirmed that intelligence had been distorted. The 2004 Senate Intelligence Committee report found that U.S. intelligence agencies had been under intense pressure to produce reports that aligned with the Bush administration's claims. The Rob Silberman Commission report, released in 2005, also confirmed that key intelligence assessments had been exaggerated and misrepresented to support the war. While the U.S. government initially claimed that the war was fighting for democracy and human rights, the treatment of prisoners in Iraq painted a very different picture. The first major scandal came in April 2004, when shocking images from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq leaked to the public. The photos showed U.S. soldiers abusing Iraqi detainees in horrifying ways. Some prisoners were forced to strip naked and form human pyramids, while soldiers laughed and posed for the camera. Others were attacked by military dogs. made to wear hoods, or subjected to electric shocks. One of the most disturbing images showed a prisoner standing on a box with wires attached to his fingers, told that he would be electrocuted if he moved. The images sparked global outrage, but the US government quickly tried to shift blame, claiming that the abuse was carried out by a few low-ranking soldiers acting on their own. However, internal documents and investigations later revealed that this was not an isolated incident. The torture at Abu Ghraib was part of a larger policy that extended far beyond a single prison. The CIA ran secret detention sites, known as black sites, where prisoners were interrogated using extreme physical and psychological abuse. At these locations, detainees were subjected to methods such as waterboarding, prolonged sleep deprivation, forced stress positions, and mock executions. Some detainees were beaten so badly that they died in custody. Others were held for years without charges, even when there was no evidence linking them to terrorism or insurgency. A key figure in the spread of these brutal methods was Donald Rumsfeld. Documents later revealed that he personally approved the use of aggressive interrogation tactics, including prolonged standing and forced nudity. The Bush administration attempted to justify these actions by claiming that they were necessary for gathering intelligence. However, reports from intelligence experts and later government investigations showed that the torture was not only inhumane, but also ineffective. Many detainees provided false information just to stop the pain, leading to poor intelligence and wrongful detentions. One of the most infamous cases of torture involved Manadel al-Jamadi, an Iraqi detainee who was beaten to death by U.S. interrogators in 2003. His body was found wrapped in plastic, his ribs broken, with clear signs of abuse. Military doctors ruled his death a homicide, but no one was ever held accountable. Cases like this were not rare. Dozens of prisoners died under U.S. custody in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations, yet the vast majority of these deaths were never fully investigated. The exposure of these abuses had serious consequences for the U.S. International human rights organizations condemned the actions of the military and the CIA, and even some U.S. allies distanced themselves from the Bush administration's policies. The scandal damaged America's global reputation, fueling anti-U.S. sentiment across the Middle East and beyond. The Senate Intelligence Committee later conducted a full investigation, confirming that the use of torture had produced little valuable intelligence and had harmed national security, rather than strengthened it. Despite the overwhelming evidence of war crimes, almost no high-ranking officials were ever punished. A few low-ranking soldiers involved in Abu Ghraib were convicted and sentenced to prison, but those who designed, approved, and oversaw the policies that led to systematic torture faced no consequences. The U.S. government eventually shut down many of its secret detention programs, but the damage had already been done. The war was expensive. In the beginning, officials estimated it would cost around $50 billion, with some even claiming that Iraq's oil revenues could help cover expenses. However, as the years went on, the financial burden of the war skyrocketed. By the time U.S. forces officially withdrew in 2011, the cost had surpassed $2.2 trillion. And that was just the beginning. The U.S. government financed much of the war by borrowing money, meaning the cost didn't stop when the troops left. Interest on the war debt continues to grow, and some economists predict that the final price could exceed $6 trillion in the coming decades. This means that Americans will still be paying for the Iraq War well into the future, long after the fighting has ended. The money spent on the war could have been used for education, could have been used for healthcare or infrastructure, but instead, it was poured into a conflict that left Iraq in ruins and did very little to make the world safer. The financial cost was staggering, but the human cost was far worse. Over 4,500 American soldiers lost their lives, and more than 32,000 were wounded, many suffering from lifelong physical and psychological trauma. But for Iraqis, the war was an unimaginable catastrophe. Entire cities were destroyed by bombings, airstrikes, and violent clashes between U.S. forces, Iraqi troops, and insurgent groups. Estimating the exact number of Iraqi casualties is difficult because the U.S. military never kept an official count of civilian deaths. This allowed officials to downplay the true impact of the war. However, independent studies and humanitarian organizations estimate that over 500,000 Iraqi civilians died as a result of war-related violence, with some sources suggesting the number could be even higher. Many were killed in bombings, crossfire, and military raids, while others died from the destruction of hospitals, water supplies, and basic infrastructure. Beyond the deaths, millions were displaced, forced to flee their homes to escape the violence. Refugee crises spread across the region, leaving families with nowhere to go and no way to rebuild their lives. Generations of Iraqis grew up in the shadow of war, surrounded by destruction, loss, and instability. The long-term effects of the conflict are still felt today, with Iraq continuing to struggle with political corruption, sectarian violence, and economic collapse. While American taxpayers spent trillions on the war, some private companies made huge profits. Halliburton, a company led by Vice President Dick Cheney, was given billions of dollars in contracts to rebuild Iraq. Many of these contracts were given without competition, meaning Halliburton got them without bidding against other companies. Other companies like Blackwater made money by providing private security services. Blackwater contractors were involved in several war crimes, including the killing of 17 unarmed Iraqi civilians in Baghdad in 2007. The U.S. government initially tried to cover up the incident, but public outrage forced them to act. The U.S. said they went to Iraq to make the world safer, but the war actually led to the rise of one of the deadliest terrorist groups in history, ISIS. When the U.S. removed Saddam Hussein from power, they dismantled the Iraqi military and government, leaving the country in chaos. Many former Iraqi soldiers, angry and unemployed, joined extremist groups. In 2014, ISIS took control of large parts of Iraq and Syria, killing thousands and causing more destruction. The U.S. had to return to Iraq to fight the very terrorists who rose because of the war. As the years passed, the truth about the Iraq War slowly came to light. One of the most shocking revelations came in 2010 when WikiLeaks released 400,000 classified U.S. military documents. These files, known as the Iraq War Logs, contained previously hidden details about the war, including thousands of unreported civilian deaths. While U.S. officials had claimed they did not keep track of civilian casualties, the documents showed that the number was much higher than what had been publicly admitted. Further confirmation that the war was based on falsehoods came in 2016, when the Chilcot Report was released. This was a major UK government investigation into Britain's role in the war, led by Sir John Chilcot. The report took 7 years to complete and revealed that the US and UK governments had exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. It also found that peaceful alternatives to war had never been fully explored, proving that the invasion was not a last resort, but a choice made for political and economic reasons. The Iraq War wasn't just a mistake, it was a war based on lies. Hundreds of thousands of people died, trillions of dollars were wasted, and Iraq was left in ruins. Even today, the effects of the war are still being felt.